Bro, it's like almost Christmas time and I got some gifts. Check out this. I didn't even know these existed. Mr. Beast merch at freaking Target. I found this at Target. That's wild. But anyways, Nvidia GPU news. RTX 5000 series, they are coming because they've been spotted in laptops based on leaks. It goes through a whole bunch of shenanigans, but basically it comes out to that these have been found in laptops at this point. They've also been listed on PCs, that pre-built PCs from different companies. RTX 5090 here, this is in Europe. We can actually break this down to get an idea of the pricing of these parts later in the video. We're gonna go over the specs and stuff first. We've actually also seen in the Witcher 4 trailer, which did come out during the Game Awards, this guy pre-rendered an Unreal Engine 5 on an unannounced Nvidia RTX GPU. So this basically means they got more GPUs on the way and they're at least in enough of a state that they can pre-render out a video. And we also know that this is coming probably soon because CES 2025 is on January 6th through the 10th, and Nvidia is going to be doing a keynote there with their CEO, Jensen Huang. This is most likely the time they're going to be announced, especially given all of the leaks and the rumors and the specs and everything. Now we can predict performance. Now we can predict price. Now we have a release date pretty much at this point in time. Let's dig the in. All right. First up, what GPUs are launching? I think that's the big thing. And Zotac has actually leaked what GPUs are coming out. It's going to be the 5090, 5090D, 5080, 5070 Ti, and 5070. All right, that's the lineup. We don't know exactly when they're going to actually be released, but they might all be announced at this event. This is at least going to be the first rollout of GPUs for 50 series that Nvidia is going to be doing. There's some reasons why they might delay the 60 class cards too that we'll talk about later. What people did is they kind of scoured the internet a little bit. They did a little bit of internet digging and they found some links on Zotac's website that actually aren't available to the public unless you go out of your way to do this. Because of this here, these new GPUs are going to be on GDDR7. Now, if you aren't aware, GDDR6 GPUs have really been around since 2018. We've been on G6 memory for so long now, it's kind of crazy, and it hasn't really gotten a ton faster. But going to GDDR7, these GPUs are actually going to have a lot faster RAM. Their bandwidth is going to be insane, and I think that's going to be one of the major driving forces of how these GPUs can be a lot faster than the previous gen. I'm talking multitudes faster. We can also see this is GDDR7, and there's a max capacity of 32 gigabytes, which means probably that the 5090 is going to have 32 gigabytes of VRAM. I don't have the old leaks pulled up, but there was rumors quite a while ago that this would be a 32 gigabyte GPU, and it just kind of lines up with that. Some confirmations here, because this was on Zotac's official website. We can also see that the 5090 is going to be based on GB202, similar to how the RTX 4090 was built on 80102. So this is Ada Lovelace, and a 102 is basically the biggest die. It's interesting how Nvidia is naming this because typically the gaming GPUs start with the 1 and then it goes to 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 6, and it'll go on to count up. And actually the higher the number, the smaller the GPU die. So you can see here the 4090, for example, has a giant die. It's 600 millimeters squared. If we look at something like here, we've got the RTX 4060, and this guy is on a die of 159 millimeters squared. Huge difference in the area on the die. So there's obviously, they can fit a whole lot more stuff on the bigger GPUs. But it's interesting that Nvidia is naming their GPUs like this because now it's starting with a 1. It used to start with a 1, but if you go over to the new one, the new GPU is starting with a 2. I think this means these are built on the Blackwell architecture. That's why it's GB. I don't know what the G stands for, but B is Blackwell. And these are being made both on the consumer gaming graphics card side and the AI graphics card side because they use AI processors for these as well. Naming it the 2, that means it's the second, I guess, priority. Nvidia themselves, and this really shows a lot of character, is that they're not putting their forefront best chips for us gaming graphics card consumers. That doesn't give me a ton of faith at the same time, but based on the specs, these are going to be pretty crazy. Now we do just look at the GB202 die here. We do have some leaks on that. It's actually supposed to be 22% larger than the Ada 8102 die from 4090. There's some reasons why I think it is larger. We know basically what process nodes, so Nvidia works with TSMC to actually make the chips themselves, like actually fabricate them. Nvidia doesn't do that themselves. Blackwell architecture is going to be based on TSMC 5 nanometers, specifically the N4P variant, and they can cram quite a bit of stuff in that, but it isn't a huge iteration off of the 4090, which was actually built on TSMC 5 nanometer. This is like an iteration on 5 nanometer. I don't think the process node on the new GPUs is actually a ton superior to the one that was used on the 40 series graphics cards, but they still want to increase the core counts and everything. I think they're going to make it quite a bit larger based off of other leaks. They're going to need to make it larger to accommodate 32 gigabytes of memory that we see with the Zotac leak here, because it needs a larger bus width to accommodate that much freaking memory on the chip. So the chip itself does have to be larger, and they might as well just put more cores on it and stuff as well. The next leak that we're seeing is the RTX 5080 is going to adopt GDDR7 modules. The 5070 Ti is also going to feature 16 gigabytes of memory. This guy is leaked by Copbyte7 Kimmy, a pretty reliable hardware leaker. And he does talk a little bit about power consumption. I'm not really going to speak on power consumption at the moment because a lot of this stuff gets confused because there's actually, in videocards.com talks about it here, there's total board power, there's total device power, and there's total graphics power. And it's really unclear when power numbers get leaked what one they're talking about. This could be a 285 watt card, or it could be a 350 watt card. We don't really know, but this is the chart that I really want to look at because this compiles all of the leaks pretty much that we've seen so far with the 5090, 5080, and 5070 Ti. Now we don't have that much information on the 5070 as of yet. I've actually seen some rumors that this guy is going to be launching in February. Let's go through all the specs. So the 5090 here is supposed to boast 21,760 CUDA cores, which in terms of CUDA cores, bigger number mean better. All right, and let's just go back to the 4090. The 4090 boasted, and this was a ton, 16,384 CUDA cores. Insane. And that is a lot of cores on it. And obviously, it's going to get just even larger with the 5090. Chart here, I did a little bit of math, and we can go ahead and look at this. Check out that. I can zoom you guys in a little bit. So I actually did a little bit of calculation just with CUDA cores. So the 4090 to the 5090. Now this is going to be 33% more cores on the 5090, plus with the memory bandwidth improvements that we'll just check out in a second. This can lead to, honestly, I think up to like 50% to 60% more performance, like on average. Oh, we got a cat. Say hi, Spooky. Cat has joined us, the Christmas cat. So if you hear purring, that's what it is. Okay, so look at this. We already saw the leak that it's supposed to have 32 gigabytes of VRAM. That's also going to be on GDDR7. That memory speed is supposed to be at 28 gigabit per second. If we look at the 4090, the 4090's VRAM was actually clocked at 21 gigabits per second. So this is a whole 7 gigabits per second faster. That's already pretty crazy. Because this has 32 gigabytes of VRAM, the VRAM at the moment is built up in 2 gigabyte modules. So each module of RAM has 2 gigabytes. So this means that there has to be 16 modules of RAM. This could change into the future, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the 5060, 5060 Ti. This is at the moment what is going on with these GPUs. Each of those modules take up 32 bits on the memory bus. So that means that this GPU is going to end up with a 512-bit memory bus. And I partially think that's why the GPU die on the 5090 is going to be so freaking massive, because it has to accommodate all of that bit bus, all of that RAM, and it needs space to be able to do that. The 4090 had a 384-bit bus because it had 24 gigabytes of VRAM. If you break that down, it's 12 modules and then 32 bits, each equals 384 bit. The 4090 already had a monstrous amount of memory bandwidth. If you look just right here, terabyte per second. Probably already saw it if you're a little observant here, but the 5090 will have 1792 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. What the f? Like, that's almost 80% more memory bandwidth. That's going to lead to some crazy numbers, especially in memory bandwidth constrained scenarios. It's going to go crazy. Spooky's standing on my desk right now. She is kind of distracting me at the moment. Like, I already see that. I'm like, oh, it's getting more VRAM. It's a larger bus. It's a bigger die, and it's a new architecture. This card is going to cost a lot of money. You know, the 4090 originally costed $1,600, but for most of its life has been going for almost $2,000. So I think honestly, they're going to drop this GPU at like $2,000. We don't have any confirmations on that right now, but we can just do some backwards stuff with the calculations that I kind of did here. But this is the entire PC cost. We'll break this down. There's no way it's going to be cheap. Nvidia has basically the clearance to charge whatever the hell they want for it at the moment, especially because AMD and Intel aren't going to have competition all the way up the 5090 price tier. I think this card is going to be ludicrously expensive, and we all know that people are going to buy it. Nvidia probably makes so much money on these. But I also want to break down, just to set the stage for the rest of the architecture here, that it's saying that this card could be 600 watts. 600 watts sounds kind of crazy. Now, the actual power connector on it, it's the 2x8 pin connector, right? And I hate that connector. I absolutely despise it. It is not a good connector. That is technically rated to be able to power 600 watts. And I think that's still to this day where a lot of these leaks usually get their info from. It's like the card could technically draw 600 watts and they're just saying it's drawing the max. It wouldn't surprise me if there is some overclocked models that do draw this much power, but I don't think Nvidia as well. I think it'll be around 450 to 500 watts. 450 to 500 watts is insane for a graphics card. Now, the 4090 drew about 450 watts and actually hovered around 400 watts for most games and loads and everything. Like, the memory is probably less efficient than GDDR6 is. I think it's more efficient technically, but because it's pushing higher speeds and higher clock speeds, it's probably going to draw more power. There's actually going to be PCIe 5.0 on these graphics cards. Every single one seems like it's going to be using PCIe 5.0. I don't think that will affect performance really at all. As long as you have a PCIe Gen 4 port, I don't think you would ever be affected by bandwidth concerns through the interface. But that also means that these cards, just by using Gen 5, it's probably going to be more expensive to even make the boards on the cards themselves. Then also, just like last generation, Nvidia launched the 4090 first, probably to capitalize on hype and everything and people buying it. They'll probably also announce the 5090 at CES, and that'll be one of the first launches. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 5080 instead. See, just comparing the 5090 to the 5080, that this is going to be massively cut down. Not only is the VRAM cut in half, the bit bus is cut in half, the memory speed, about the same, but the actual memory bandwidth cut in half as well. And that is definitely going to hurt. Then you also see the CUDA core count, pretty much half of what the 5090 will be, even though this is only one smaller die. It's going from 202 to 203. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll be half the performance, but based on the memory speed differences between these cards, I would expect the 5090 is probably going to be like 60% faster than the 5080. Probably be a pretty large difference. And Nvidia is going to be separating their already high-end 5080, because the 4080 was $1,200. They're going to separate that even more. Look at my little calculation here. So if we compare it to the 4080, I guess I should probably show what the 4080 had. In terms of CUDA core counts, had 9,728 CUDA cores. And by this calculation, that means that the 5080 actually only has 11% more CUDA cores. You know, these CUDA cores could be a little bit more efficient. I'm not 100% sure. So I really think the only main difference between the 4080 and 5080 is probably going to be the memory bandwidth. When we do look at the 4080, this guy had 700 gigabytes-ish per second of bandwidth on their memory. But if we do look at what the 5080 will end up being, about 200 more gigabytes per second of bandwidth, 900-ish gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which is actually nearing a 4090 in terms of bandwidth. But I don't think the 5080 is going to be a huge leap over the 4080 unless Nvidia is going to be pulling out some crazy new feature, something like that. I would expect the 5080 to probably be about 30% faster than a 4080, maybe 40% if it's like generous. Like, it's gonna have the same amount of VRAM, so I could see 16 gigabytes of VRAM be pressuring it quite a bit. I don't think the 5080 is going to be that impressive of a card, and it's going to be similar probably to how going from the 3080 to the 4080 was, where the 4080 was really expensive and it was faster and it had more VRAM, but it just wasn't that much better at the end of the day. A lot of people weren't excited about the 4080. I don't think the 5080 is going to be that exciting either, because if this ends up launching at $1,200, the 5080 would be really expensive, because that's what the 4080 ended up launching at. And then they made a 4080 Super, which was basically the exact same card, but it actually just cut down the price by $200 and made it $1,000. So I'm hoping that Nvidia ends up matching the $1,000 price point. And at that point, I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world. It's like probably an okay value. Now, something that we don't see in these leaks up to this point in time is the clock speed of the graphics cards. So depending on how fast they actually are going, maybe it could leap further ahead of the 4080. To me, what's screaming is the rumored power draw, and I don't know how accurate this really is, but it is saying that it's 400 watts. And based on my testing with an RTX 4080 Super, that card is like only barely cracking 300 watts a lot of the time. If this power consumption is accurate, a 5080 is going to draw a lot more power. And that could mean that they're shoving more clock speed into it. But with that, let's actually go to the GPU that I think will probably be a better value. And that's the 5070 Ti. Because this guy, kind of like the 5080, is going to be rocking 16 gigabytes of VRAM, very similar to the 4070 Ti Super from this current generation. You can see the CUDA core count isn't crazy cut down from the 5080. They're on the same die. They're still on the GP203, much like how 40 series was with the 4080 and then the 4070 Ti Super. They're on the same die. On the memory bandwidth will be the same, but it looks like the power consumption, at least based off of rumors right now, is going to be quite a bit lower than the 5080. Still a lot of power, like 285 watt card is kind of crazy. I think this card will actually be a pretty good value based on the price, really. And that really does come down to the price, at least compared to the 5080. If this card ends up being like $800, which the 4070 Ti was before, the 4070 Ti was a $800 graphics card. And back then, Nvidia was hella delusional, because the 4070 Ti freaking had 12 gigabytes of VRAM at $800, which is, Nvidia can't be stopped apparently. New 5070 Ti looks like it's actually matching the 4070 Ti Super more in terms of specs here. And it's gonna have 16 gigabytes of VRAM like this card did. And this card did end up costing $800. 5070 Ti is rumored to be on GB203, and then the 5080 is also on GB203. So I have a feeling that it still might cost $800. This looks like the exact same way that they cut down 4080 to the 4070 Ti Super. 8960 CUDA cores on the 5070 Ti, at least based off of the rumors. And if we see the 4070 Ti Super, this guy 8448 cores. 4070 Ti original had 7680 cores. If you just look at the 4070 Ti versus the 5070 Ti, a 17% increase in CUDA cores. Now, CUDA cores don't always result in one-to-one performance uplift, so this might not exactly mean just 17% more performance, but 17% faster is pretty decent. Plus, with the extra memory bandwidth, 896 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, and then the 4070 Ti original here had 500 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, freaking 400 gigabytes per second of bandwidth difference. That is 80% faster on the memory. So this really could end up being, I would probably predict about 30 to 40% faster most of the time, while having more VRAM than its original predecessor. But again, I think this card is actually more closely comparing to the 4070 Ti Super. And if we do look at that card instead, then there's actually only a 6% increase in the CUDA cores to the 5070 Ti. To me, that kind of blows me away. That is really not a huge increase in CUDA core count. And if we do compare the memory bandwidth, then we see the 4070 Ti Super actually had 670 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. Go to the other card, 896. So really, there's only gonna be like a 200 gigabyte per second-ish, maybe 250 gigabyte per second-ish memory bandwidth between these two cards. And I don't really think that's a whole lot. The 5070 Ti will be faster than the 4070 Ti Super, depends what features and stuff, if they introduce anything new with 50 series. I would predict about 20%, maybe 30% faster than the 4070 Ti Super based off the bandwidth, based off the slightly higher CUDA core count. I think that's even pushing it though. That'd be like if it's optimistic. It could only be 20% faster, maybe even less. And it does depend on the clock speed too, remember that. But you know, comparing to the 5080, I think the 5070 Ti is probably going to be the better deal a lot of the time. And it's the same thing with the last generation, the 4070 Ti Super versus the 4080. I was recommending the 4070 Ti Super more often than the 4080 Super. And lastly, we can go over the 5070. And at the moment, it's still rumored is going to have 12 gigabytes of VRAM. But if it ends up going for $600 at launch, which wouldn't surprise me if Nvidia does that, because they seem to be out of touch a lot of times, that means a $600 graphics card is going to be offering the same amount of VRAM as Intel's B580 graphics cards, which only cost $250. Put that in perspective, you're going to be paying more than twice the amount to get the exact same amount of VRAM. Now the performance will probably be quite a bit higher. We don't really know anything about the 5070 at the moment, maybe around 30% faster than the 4070. And actually having 12 gigabytes of VRAM, because it is faster, you're probably going to want to target higher settings, and especially playing at 1440p. And 12 gigabytes, I mean, I did so much testing on this, is like barely enough to even do that. Like, you're pushing it at 12 gigabytes. I don't think that this card is going to be very attractive at all. Now, again, we don't know that much about it right now. So I think we just go ahead and we actually move on to the RTX 5060 Ti and the 5060, because these cards are probably the most bizarre ones, and everybody's probably wanting some decent budget GPUs from Nvidia, and that doesn't seem to be what we're going to end up getting here, at least in the first round, because things could change in the future if they do a super refresh, which could come possibly sooner than we think. But you see this leak here from WCCF Tech. Now they got this from their own sources. They're saying that the 5060 Ti is going to get 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is how the 4060 Ti always should have been. How the hell is Nvidia charging $400 for an 8 gigabyte GPU in freaking 2024? I don't understand. It's so bad. But they offered a 16 gigabyte variant of that card, but it originally costed $500, and nowadays it costs about $450. So it's like a little bit better, but holy shit, bro, that card is wow. It is atrocious. At least the base model looks like it's going to be getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And the RTX 5060 looks like it's still going to be 8 gigabytes. Bro, people want a decent 1440p option, and I think Intel making their B580 is possibly secured at this point in time. I don't think Nvidia is going to be competing with 12 gigabytes of VRAM at the reasonable price point. Now, a lot of people still might buy up the 5060, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be a good deal if it has 8 gigabytes. It's going to be a terrible card. WCCF Tech here has a little bit of a leak. Actually, I like videocards.com also reported on that leak. I like the chart a little bit better. I'm kind of a videocards.com fanboy, you know what I mean? But this chart looks so nice. Look how nice it looks. These are going to have 8 gigabytes of VRAM, is again what we talked about with the 5090. These have 128-bit bus, and you divide 32 by the bits, and that means you have spots for 4 modules. And that means 8 gigabytes total, because there's 2 gigabyte modules at the moment. But then you're probably wondering, how does the 5060 Ti have 16 gigabytes if there's only 4 slots available? Well, actually, what they can do, take the memory and they put it on both sides of the PCB. So basically they can double the memory capacity while keeping the same bus width, which sucks because the memory is pretty slow. The 5060 Ti just looks like it's going to be an upsell to the 5060. Now, if we do compare it to the older cards, here's the 4060 and 4060 Ti. The 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte did exist, but they're not listing it here. They just show you the 8 and 16. The 4060 had 128-bit bus. The 4060 Ti did as well. And they're actually rocking 17 gigabit per second and 18 gigabit per second memory. Now, I think one of the big upgrades on these cards, which sucks because if you have 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 4060, who gives up the VRAM is faster, but because they're going to be in GDDR7 VRAM, they're going to be up to 28 gigabit per second memory, which is fast. That is some fast ass memory. And that means that the memory bandwidth does increase by almost 2 times. That is a pretty big increase going from, like, say on the 4060 Ti, 288 gigabytes per second up to 448 gigabytes per second. The Intel Arc B580, for example, now this card has a 192-bit bus, but it's on GDDR6. But because it has a higher bus width, it can get faster VRAM. And if you do look at this here, that this ends up getting 456 gigabytes per second of VRAM. If we actually look at AMD's latest generation too, even their leaked their next 8000 series GPUs. This also looks like AMD's next gen GPUs will still be using GDDR6. So Nvidia is going to have an advantage even with these lower end cards, that they can actually get away with a lower bus width, which probably just saves them money at the end of the day. It's still going to probably cost just as much for us. They don't have to make the GPU die nearly as big to compensate for all the extra modules of RAM, but they can still get very fast bandwidth that's competitive with the other brands, probably at the same price, unless GDDR7 is really expensive at the moment, but they're gonna have to use less modules. I think they'll probably end up saving money in the long run. Rumored release date of these is late Q1 2025, so it's probably gonna be March-ish. That gets interesting, as there's actually some more rumors about GDDR7 that it's going to be upgraded in the future. Instead of having 2 GB modules, by having 3 GB module. I actually confirmed at this point in time, because see here that Samsung is already gearing up 24, this is 24 gigabit, but that's actually 3 GB modules on the GDDR7 memory. They're gonna be higher capacity, and they're actually gonna be faster as well. So we saw 28 gigabit per second before, but this will be up to 42 gigabit per second, which is actually a really large, so the memory could even be way faster, especially on their higher tier cards. I'm guessing this memory will be quite expensive based on how fast it is and how high capacity it is, because I think they'll probably throw on lower speed ones onto their lower end cards. At least that's what I would expect. You know, for 128-bit bus, that could actually mean this 5060 could end up being a 12 gigabyte GPU, which I think if it ends up costing $300 like the 4060 did, that's actually not that bad of a card. And the 5060 Ti, I have a feeling they probably wouldn't give us 24 gigabytes of VRAM. That's just my opinion. I don't think that would happen. Now, if it does end up being that and they have faster VRAM, like say even if it went up to 32 gigabit per second, that means we could see even faster, like over 500 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth on these cards. Why we're still predicting 8 gigabytes of VRAM to be on these cards is because of when this new VRAM is going to be coming out. It's not really that close. Samsung, the company, the first company is actually making it. It's actually going to be announced in February at a press conference or a keynote or something that Samsung is going to be doing. To be honest, if that's when the chips are just starting to be made, I don't think the 5060, if it does even come out in late March, I don't think it's going to be able to hit production with this memory as of that time, but it might be possible. Like if we get lucky, then maybe the first GPU that comes out could have this 3 gigabyte module on it. I guess it's possible if Nvidia does delay the 5060, which would be preferred, because we don't literally, if you're paying $300 for an 8 gigabyte graphics card, you're just buying e-waste at this point. Just don't buy it. It's stupid. For reference though, this might not end up being an 8 gigabyte GPU. And with all the specs out of the way and predicted performance, let's just go ahead and see what kind of price these might end up costing. Now, some companies have accidentally listed like 5090s and 5080s in pre-built PCs. So here's a 5080, here's a 5090. And what I tried to do is basically look these up on the US market. Now, remember that there's probably going to be an upcharge on brand new GPUs, just at least by a little bit because it's new, and they're probably clearing stock of these older systems at the moment. 5090 PC, which I forget what website actually listed this. I think it's literally Acer Predator PCs at a German retailer. That's where this was listed. It has 2 terabytes of SSD storage, a Core Ultra 9 processor, and 128 gigabytes of RAM. We see here that it's costing 6,000 euros. Now, if I'm going to relate it to the US, now if you're in Europe, convenient, just look at the prices like that, okay? You'd actually see right below it that it says including VAT plus shipping costs. So this is the actual price you're going to be paying, whereas in the US, you end up putting sales tax on after you buy the product. So I did a little calculation here, what are these proportions or whatever, but the 5090 PC, at least in US pricing, this is assuming that the euro and the US dollar cost exactly the same, which they don't, but is going to cost $5,216. If they cost like both $5,200, then technically the 5090 would be probably the exact same price as the 4090, which would mean that it would be costing $1,600 MSRP. I just looked up RTX 4090 gaming PC, and then here I actually checked more than 1 terabyte. Actually, I can check down to 2. We're basically going to be looking for an Intel processor, also with 128 gigabytes of RAM. Try to match the actual spec config, as much as possible. Quite a few systems that are relatively close. Say like this one here is maybe the closest one. A Ryzen 7950X3D with a 4090 costs $5,600. Now, this ends up being like currency conversion and stuff. I don't know. Like, I think the US dollar is actually worth less right now than the euro, but I did actually pick out this one as the one that probably is the closest comparison because it has a high-end Intel processor on it, has 128 gigabytes of RAM, and this is about $5,500, $5,600. At the end of the day, on the 5090 PC, you know, it'd have to be costing this to be the same, which, you know, based off of that leak, then I'm a little bit like, I don't know, to be honest. It's so hard to tell. There's so many variables. Currency conversion, prices of each parts they use individually, how much of an upcharge does the company do for building the PC, that I can't really tell. My predicted price for the 5090 though is going to be about $2,000, I would think, because the 4090 has been selling at it. I think Nvidia will just do the same thing again. Those are my thoughts on them. I think the 5090 is going to be insane. You really shouldn't buy it, but I know people will. And the 5080 looks kind of mid. I would say the 5070 Ti looks like it's going to end up being the better option. It does depend how much they do separate them with clock speeds and all that kind of stuff. And the 5070, don't know yet. 4060 Ti, maybe okay. And the 4060, if it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, is going to be terrible, and don't buy it. But let's go ahead and look at just a couple more things, because how is Nvidia going to separate, other than performance, how are they going to separate this GPU generation versus the 40 series? But I think Nvidia will actually built in better support for their frame generation performance. So I don't know if you guys have experienced a 40 series graphics cards with DLSS frame generation. If you actually go to use it, a lot of the time the GPU just like can't really get that many extra frames with frame generation. Like, I see a lot of times you only get like 30 to 40% more frames or smoother appearance by turning on frame generation. It's because when you are GPU limited in a game, then the GPU can't make enough space to do the frame generation, and then you don't end up getting that much out of it. So I think Nvidia will probably lean more heavily on the frame generation hardware on these GPUs to make that more effective more of the time. That will be hard to market, so I don't know how they'll present that to us, because they always presented frame generation as being like 2 times faster already. Now, another side, neural rendering. Now, Nvidia is obviously obsessed with AI, compressed textures in games. They want to use it for ray tracing, path tracing, ray reconstruction, upscaling, frame generation. I think it was even like neural optimization of like meshes and stuff in games, which actually would be really cool. They've already showed off like neural compression. Basically what it does is compress really highly detailed textures in games without taking nearly as much space and having a little bit of overhead on the GPU. A lot better like graphics for a lot less file size, and probably help with their VRAM constraints on their graphics cards, knowing Nvidia. Again, I don't think this marketing is very strong, so I think Nvidia is going to be leaning more on this generation of the marketing on the performance. And later on in the generation too, we might end up seeing super series cards that have more VRAM with those GDDR7 3GB modules and stuff. So I think a lot of this generation will be more of a performance generation rather than a feature generation. Also, HDMI 2.2 is coming out, which will end up matching the high-end display port in terms of bandwidth, at least it seems to being, and that means we could be driving higher resolutions and frame rate without display stream compression. The last thing I wanted to show you guys is this is pretty interesting. This is Surface, because the RTX 4090 Ti, a prototype of it, was actually just found in the trash somewhere. I guess Nvidia threw it out, and you can see that this is actually the whole PCB for the board, and this was rumored for a while that this did exist. Basically, the PCB would be parallel to the motherboard, plug in like at like a 90-degree angle like this, and the PCB would sit down like this. So it'd almost be like the PCB would have a CPU cooler almost like mounted to the side of it, and then the airflow would be going down it like on the side, which I don't know if that would be more effective or not. This seems needlessly complicated, but at the end of the day, it's kind of cool, I guess, that this maybe existed. We always knew that there could have been a 4090 Ti, because the 4090 wasn't actually the full Ada Lovelace die. It could have gone bigger, but it had no reason to go bigger because AMD wasn't competing anyways. You can even see the display connectors, because the PCB was wonky, actually like was on the side like that, and it looked like this. And let me know what you think about 50 series graphics cards. I don't know if I'm going to be uploading again before Christmas, so if I don't, then Merry Christmas to you, and I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Y'all have a good one. Merry Christmas. Peace.